That's what this is all about. That's it. And we have some guests here, and then we also have live stream. This is the third book of Lynne's that we've done an interview for. And it's all about strong French women. And you can watch our first two interviews on the Nina McLemore YouTube. And I would encourage you to do that. The first was Madame Fourcade's Secret War, about Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who led, I think, the largest spy network in France, and was really instrumental in the information for D-Day and for the Germans, and for the Allied forces being able to know exactly where to land and what they were going to find. And then the Empress of the Nile, about Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt, who is a French archaeologist, is the person I think, from reading the book, is most responsible for saving Abu Simbel and the monuments of Nubia. I mean, it was a major feat. Can you imagine moving a sandstone temple up 300, 500 feet?
I think it was a little bit more than that, 700 feet.
700
like
feet.
Yeah.
Sandstone, doesn't work. But she figured out how to do it. And we also have with us tonight Dory, how do you say, Dimby Laurent, who has been Lynne's translator of the documents. So she's helped Lynne she's been partnering with Lynne to doing the research. So Lynne has written 10 books, which is amazing, and her last book was only 2 years ago. So and the book before that was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So how she's managed to do this, I don't know. And she's the award-winning author with her husband, I think, of Freedom's Daughters, the unsung hero of the civil rights movement.
He didn't write that.
Okay. She wrote that solo. Okay.
I wrote that solo.
And she's written extensively on World War II and the relationship between the U.S. and England, with Citizens of London, Last Hope Island, which is the one about the Polish pilots.
Now, Last Hope Island is about all the countries of occupied Europe whose governments went to London during the war,
Right.
including Poland, yeah.
And Charles de Gaulle.
And Charles de Gaulle, very prominently.
And Those Angry Days. So today we're discussing the latest book, The Sisterhood of Ravensbruk. Ravensbruk was a concentration camp during World War II, and it's not as well known as some of the other ones for various reasons. And it's located east of Berlin, and it was exclusively for women, and it was a work camp, supposedly. And this is the study of the story of the camp and how some courageous, determined, and positive French women resisted the Nazis and helped one another survive, and then after the war to rebuild their lives and continue to support one another. So I will now move to my questions. The first one, is there a significance that your last three books, and now the last two books, and now the Sisterhood, have all been about strong, daring French women who contributed to the resistance?
No, first of all, let me thank you, Nina, for inviting me to your new place. This is so exciting. Dory and I have been involved, as Nina said, in two other interviews, and we've very much loved each one of them, and so I'm really happy to be back with you. No, there is no coincidence. I mean, basically, I've written, as you said, I've written 10 books, and actually, most of them, they follow from the book before. I mean, so, people ask me why I got involved in World War II. Did I always want to write about World War II? No, I didn't. It was an accident. The first book kind of engendered the second book, then the third book, then the fourth book. And that's really what happened with these last three books. The first 7 books were basically, with one exception, Freedom's Daughters, were about World War II and were basically focused on England and to some extent the United States. So that was my, that was what I was writing about. And I always wanted to write about women in these books, but because I write about World War II, which is basically a male subject, I didn't really get a chance to do much. I did, whenever I had a chance to write about a strong woman, and there were several examples of that in the early books, I took that. But I changed my focus dramatically after the 7th book when I was going into the 8th, and that was Madame Foucault's Secret War. I had, in a number of my books, I had written about various resistance movements in the occupied countries of Europe. All the occupied countries of Europe had a resistance movement. But when I was writing about the French resistance movement, I kept coming across the name of this woman, Marie-Madeleine Foucault. Not much. I mean, there would be a sentence or a paragraph about her. But I learned that she, as Nina said, she ran the largest and most influential spy network in occupied France. And I had never heard of her. And I thought, surely there must have been a book about her. Because it's not only that's incredible, but she was also very young and very beautiful. I mean, it was just an amazing story. And there was nothing written about her. So she was an unsung hero. Most of my books deal with what I call unsung heroes, and she definitely was one of them. So I thought, okay, I think I'm going to write a book about her. So my focus then switched from England to France, and it has remained on France for the next 2 books because, as I said, one book leads to another. When I wrote Marie-Madeleine Foucault, I discovered in doing the research about, much more research about the French resistance, I discovered Christiane de Roche-Noble-Court, who was in a different resistance network. She was involved in the first organized resistance network in Paris. She was at the Louvre. She was an Egyptologist, an young archaeologist at the Louvre. So during the week, she would be working at the Louvre, and at night and on weekends, she would be in the resistance. And that was only part of the book. I mean, as Nina said, my focus is really on her life after the war and what she did to save these temples in Egypt. But I mean, she was another incredibly strong woman who did not get the attention, I think, after the, that she deserved. So that book then, it led me to the Sisterhood of Ravensbruk. Again, another book about women, and another book about the French resistance. So there is a path that leads from one to another, and it's been really fun to switch from. I mean, I loved writing the books I wrote, Citizens of London, and a number of others that really dealt with London and England and the U.S. during the war. But I was getting a little tired of it, and it's been really a pleasure to write about France, because it's a subject that I knew something about because I had done so much work in terms of research on World War II. But in many ways it was an unknown subject, and so that's why I've continued to do it.
So what was Ravensbruk, and why don't we know more about it? I mean, we know about Dachau and Auschwitz and other places. So why don't we know more about it? How many inmates were there, and how many survived?
Okay. Yeah, as you said, it was the only all-female German concentration camp. We don't know really how many were there. The number that's bandied about is about 130,000 women over the course of 5 years. Many of them, if not most of them, came from resistance movements. They were sent there. They were arrested and sent there because they had been in the resistance in their various countries. We don't know how many died there either, because the number ranges from 30,000 to 60,000. Part of the reason why we don't know the exact, the exact numbers, that would be hard to do anyway. But Ravensbruk, being the only all-female camp, toward the end of the war got incredibly crowded because the Germans were closing camps like Auschwitz as the Russians were invading from the east. They were closing some of their camps in Poland, and they were sending the women to Ravensbruk. So by the end of the war, Ravensbruk was built for like 5,000 people. It had more than 45,000 women in that camp at the end of the war, and the authority had broken down completely. So women were coming into the camp and they weren't ever registered. So that the same is true in terms of the numbers of deaths. I mean, it's all estimated. As I said, 35 to 60,000. I mean, that's a huge, huge number. This was, as Nina said, this was not considered a death camp. This was not an extermination camp. But in a way, it was a death camp because it was a labor camp, and that's true of most of the German concentration camps. But it was a slow death camp. I mean, nobody was expected to leave there alive. That women were brought in and they were sent to work in factories and various other places as slave labor. The conditions were atrocious, very little food, and they were worked to death, basically. So a woman worked as long as she could possibly do. Sometimes it was just a matter of months, and then when she couldn't work anymore, she was killed, and then a new crop of women would come in. Why don't we know about it? Basically, I mean, there are a number of reasons. I think one of them is because it was all female, quite frankly. But a more obvious reason is because unlike camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, which were also in Germany, Ravensbruk, well, first of all, Dachau and Buchenwald were liberated by American troops. And French troops. I mean, there were troops from other countries too, but mostly by American troops, which meant that American journalists were accompanying those troops. And so as a result, we got the photographs and the newsreel footage of stacks of bodies and skeleton-like survivors that we all have seen. But it was because of the American journalists that were there. Edward R. Murrow, the great CBS correspondent, did a harrowing broadcast from Buchenwald that has gone down in history as a classic. And everybody in the U.S. pretty much heard it because he was the most popular journalist in the country. So that they were very well known. Ravensbruk, on the other hand, was liberated by Soviet troops, which meant that there were no journalists along. And it was in the Soviet, after the war, it was in the Soviet zone of Germany, of occupied Germany. So it was, by that time it was closed off. And so nobody was allowed to come in. And after the war, obviously, it wasn't a concentration camp. It was the Soviet military camp. So, basically, Ravensbruk was forgotten. There have been a number of books about the other concentration camps, but really only one kind of, overall history of Ravensbruk. So it was forgotten, and the women that were there were basically forgotten too.
So the book is about 4 women in particular. I mean, it's about many other people, but 4 women in particular who were in the French resistance and what they did in the camp. And the one I remember in terms of when she went to the camp was Germaine Trillon. And she went to the camp in October of 1943. So that gives you a sense. She was in the resistance before that. So give us a little bit about each one of the women and what they did. Oh, I forgot to say, the cards on your chair are for questions. So, excuse me. what did they do in the resistance?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when did they get to the camp? And tell us a little bit about their characters and their backgrounds.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I chose 4. I mean, as Nina said, there were far more. You know, I could have written this book about Polish women, but there was something about the French women, and I've spent so much time on French women and the resistance. I was just very struck by this story of these. It wasn't just these 4. It was, you know, a group of French women. It was, I mean, the French there were only about 7,000 French women in the camp throughout the war. There was a very small minority compared to, for example, the Poles had tens of thousands of women there. But the French, as I said, only had about 7,000. Almost all of them had worked in the resistance. And these 4 in particular were leaders of this group that basically resisted the Germans in the camp. And so, yes, I will tell you a little bit. Germaine Tillion is kind of the leader of the group. She was an anthropologist, a French anthropologist, very, you know, like French version of Margaret Mead, the American anthropologist. She spent her early years studying Arab tribes in Algeria, the mountains of Algeria. She was told, she was a young woman, she's in her 20s, she was told not to go there, that these were fierce Arab tribes, they would kill her, et cetera, et cetera. And she ignored them and went, and they loved her. And so she spent, you know, like 6 years going back and forth between France and Algeria, and stayed there until the war broke out. And then she came back, and she was one of the very first people in France to rebel, to resist the Germans. I mean, you know, most of you, I'm sure, know that, you know, when France was invaded in 1940, everybody was shocked that France was first of all, capitulated, but that it was defeated so easily by the Germans. I mean, it was total shock in the country. And, you know, when the Germans started occupying, the French couldn't believe it, and so basically they were keeping their heads down. I mean, the last thought they had was resisting. But there were a few who started resisting right away. And Germaine Tillion, and at that time was in her early 30s, she was one of them. And she helped organize the first organized resistance group in Paris. It was called the Museum of Man Network. The Museum of Man is the anthropological museum in Paris. So it was a group of intellectuals, actually. It was really interesting. It was museum curators like Christiane Desroches-Noblescourt, and other workers and artists and writers, etc. So it wasn't your usual, you know, you didn't think they were saboteurs or whatever. But the other interesting thing about this first group is that it was basically organized by women for the most part, because the French, you know, this is right after the capitulation of the government to Germany, and most of the men were in the army. Most of the younger men and middle-aged men were in the army. They had either been captured by the Germans, or they were in hiding, or they had not yet been demobilized. So there were very few young men in Paris. So the women kind of just took over and kick-started the resistance, and Germaine was one of them. So she was involved in the resistance for a couple of years, and then was betrayed by a French priest, was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to jail, and then eventually to Ravensbruk. I'll get to her. I'll go through the others very quickly. The second one was Geneviève de Gaulle. The name sounds familiar, and it is because she was the niece of Charles de Gaulle. She was this young, reserved, studious, quiet young woman, but she was every bit as fierce as her uncle. She and her uncle were incredibly close and remained very close throughout their lives. I mean, Charles de Gaulle was hated by so many people, or, you know, like he was impossible to get along with. But he was not impossible to get along with Geneviève. Geneviève and he were, they had this I mean, she was closer to him than she was to her own father. But anyway, she also, and she was younger than Germaine. Germaine was in her 30s. Geneviève was 19 when she first started. She was a college student when the war, when the occupation began. And she made her way up. She joined an organization called the Défense de la France, which was one of the biggest resistance organizations. And she became the managing editor of their newspaper, which by the end of the war was publishing 450,000 copies. She also was betrayed and was arrested at the age of 21 and went to Ravensbruk about 3 months after Germaine. The third one was Agnès Girard. Agnès Girard was a college student who was very, very elbows out. Her mother homeschooled her kids, including Agnès, in the Montessori system. So Agnès was used to she had no rules, and she couldn't stand any rules. I mean, she was very, very, she was tough-minded from the time she was a little girl. When the Germans invaded, she wanted to go to London and enlist in de Gaulle's army. Her mother said she could go if she could find somebody to go with her. She couldn't. So therefore, she got into the resistance at the age of 18 and was in an intelligence network. And she was going around Paris and, reporting on the German military presence. She eventually was caught by the Gestapo and was sent to Ravensbrück on the same train carrying Germaine Tillion. And so they joined together, this 19-year-old and this 32-year-old, and became the closest of friends on that awful train trip to Ravensbrück. And so she's the third one. The fourth is Jacqueline d'Alencourt, who was a countess. She was also very, very young. She was in a group, another resistance group, a network that was based in Paris, and she was a courier and a code breaker. I mean, she wrote codes. So she also came to Ravensbrück. So the four of them did not know each other, when they were working. I mean, these women and the French women in the camp, the other French women, came from all over France. It wasn't just these particular four actually came from Paris, but they came from all over France, and they were they came from every kind of background you can imagine. They were workers. There were the seamstresses. There were office workers. There were cooks. There were countesses, lawyers, doctors. From every kind of background that you can imagine. Young, most of them are young. Germaine was kind of getting up there in age. There were some women who were in their 50s and 60s, but not very many. Most of them were in that 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. So they all ended up in Ravensbrück.
So now tell us about what the conditions were really like.
The conditions were horrible. I mean, I go into great detail about these were, the ones I'm writing about most were upper middle class. They came from upper middle class backgrounds, and they had, got to this camp, and it was like looking at zombies. It was these women whose eyes were dead, and wearing prison dresses and kerchiefs, and just dragging themselves around, and they couldn't believe it. I mean, Geneviève de Gaulle said it was like being dropped into a strange land. They couldn't conceive of what this was like. And what was really interesting about this group is that they were basically schooled. I mean, the French started coming in 1943, so they came in, as I said, quite late. Obviously the first people there would be the Germans and the Poles, because the Poles were invaded in 1939. The Czechs, because the Czechoslovakia fell to the Germans much earlier. And then you had the Dutch and the Belgians and all. So France was, having been invaded in June 1940, May 1940, it took a while for the resistance to get going. And so many of these women, most of these women didn't come until like 42, 43, and 44.
Can I interrupt you for a
Yeah.
second? How much does that have to do with the fact that the Germans did not see women as enemies in the beginning?
Right.
That the women were able to get around.
That was true. That was true, especially in France. I mean, especially young women. I mean, young women. The Germans were conservatives. I mean, they came from a very conservative society like France. France is a very conservative society back then, and women weren't expected. I mean, nobody expected women to be in those roles. Women were supposed to be wives and mothers, and and they were second-class citizens. And the Germans had a hard time accepting the idea that women would be involved in the resistance. And so, yeah, especially young women played on that. They could get away, at least for a time, with stuff that men couldn't. First of all, young men, there were not many young men around. So, I mean, you had to be very careful if you were a young man. But a young girl, she could flirt, she could, and so it took the Germans a long while to catch on that in fact, that women were just as involved in the resistance as men were. And so that's probably one reason. And also, the Germans were much more polite to the French initially than they were, say, certainly to the Poles or the Czechs, who were considered Untermenschen. But especially Paris, but France was considered a civilized country. They were trying to, if not impress them, but they considered them, Aryans, and so there was an attempt, at least in the beginning, to be fairly civil to the French. That soon changed. It changed actually fairly quickly.
So back to the camp.
Yeah.
I interrupted you.
Okay. So what was impressive about the French is that these younger women, when they came in, were schooled. Basically, when they came in and were just so stunned by what they saw, they had a teacher, and that was Germaine Tillion. She had arrived in October 1943. She had lost she had a huge sack of all the research she had done in Algeria. And she thought she was going to write her doctoral dissertation, that she was going to have plenty of time in the camp, not knowing at all what this camp was like. And all her research was taken away from her. So what she did was to do an anthropological study of Ravensbruk. And she studied how it worked. And she enlisted the help, along with Anise, who was basically her partner in this. They enlisted the help of a lot of inmates who were working, for example, in the offices. The inmates basically ran the prison in terms of doing most of the work. I mean, obviously there were German authorities over them, but they were in the offices. They ran the infirmary. They did the hard physical work. Germaine got to know a lot of the women who were in the offices and who were actually working with the Germans. And she found out what it was like, what was really going on in the camp. And she spent months doing that. And so she was an anthropologist. She was doing her job. What that enabled her to do was to basically step back. And she talked a lot about it. She said, once you have information about how something actually works, you don't feel as helpless. And so she did that, and then when young French women started coming in, almost immediately after they came in, she would sneak over to the barracks, to the barracks where they were put initially, and she would lecture them. She would tell them about how the camp operated. And there were two things that she told them above all. One is that they had to band together, that by themselves there was no way they could survive. There absolutely no way they could survive. If they banded together in a community and took care of each other, then there was a slight chance they could survive. The other thing she said is, you have to resist. We have to stand up against them. And those were her two mantras. And they became the mantras of all these other women. I mean, I'm not saying that every French woman followed them, but a lot of them did. And so the French women became known for that, for the way they stuck together, in no matter what the circumstances was, and in the way they rebelled against the Germans.
In terms of food and clothing and heat and sanitary and, you know, health, what was it like?
Oh, it was just awful. The food was bad to begin with, but as more and more women came in, thousands more women came in, toward the end of the war there was almost no food. The camp was a petri dish of disease. You know, when you have that many people, apparently initially Ravensbruk wasn't that bad because it only had like 4,000 or 5,000, but as you get more and more people, and basically they didn't care. The Germans didn't care. There was sanitary conditions were dreadful. People were getting sick right and left. They were still forced to work. The working conditions were god awful. Many of them worked in like sewing factories, etc. Many of them were sent to munitions factories. It was god awful. Just, I mean, I don't want to even go into it. It was a very difficult book to write because of what the conditions that these women were in constantly. And they were always in constant, under the constant threat of being killed. I mean, you could be killed by working too slowly. You could be killed for questioning a guard. You could be, I mean, death was sudden and unexpected. So it was hell. I mean, these women went through hell, and many of them for well over a year, and sometimes 2 years.
So by 1944, late in 44, there was some change that happened in the camp. One maybe for the better and one for the worse. And there were more killings, and there were people who were then treated better than they had been before. So what was going on, Himmler, what was going on when the Germans began to realize they were going to lose?
First of all, there weren't too many that were treated better.
Right, okay.
Yes, I mean, by 1943, it was really clear that the Germans were going downhill.
43 or 44?
Well, 43 is when it began, but then 44 was obviously when the Allies invaded, D-Day, and in 1944, June 1944, and then it became quite obvious that the Germans were really, you know, getting closer to defeat. And so the killings started to increase. And finally, in the end of 1944, they put in a gas chamber. There was no gas chamber in Ravensbruk before November, December 1944, but they needed to kill. They needed to kill as many women as they could. They were ordered to do that. And so a gas chamber. So you
I just want to stop you. Why were they ordered to kill?
Because Hitler didn't want anybody left, you know, at the end of the war. That was true of all the camps. That there were, he ordered that there would be no survivors in these camps. So I go into a great deal of the kind of what was going on outside the camp, you know, the attempt on the part of many people to get the Allies, to get the governments to, like, do something about prisoners, you know, to organize rescue attempts, etc. And the Allied governments, the US government, the British government said, no, we're focusing on ending the war. We have to end the war, and then we will deal with trying to get the prisoners out. You know, and at one point they said the concentration camp prisoners should hang on. You know, they were dying by the dozens and hundreds eventually every day, and so, you know, that wasn't that wasn't working. So it was a very, very, very difficult time. From what I'm saying, you could, it is, you know, it is a kind of a bleak existence, to put it mildly. But I also want to make it clear that because of these Frenchwomen's banding together, you know, there was a certain amount of, I won't say joy, but the companionship that they, you know, the friendships they formed. You know, and even they even laughed. I mean, Germaine Tillion is one of the most incredible women I've ever written about. She actually wrote a operetta musical review in Ravensbruk because everybody was getting so depressed, not surprisingly. Everybody thought they were going to die before the end of the war, that they would not leave that camp alive. And so she decided that she had to make people laugh. So she, over a course of 10 days, hid in a crate. Her work group was working, and they hid her in a crate. And for 10 days, she sat and wrote an operetta musical review, full of songs and dances, and it's basically making fun of the Germans. And so, you know, on their way to work and on the way back from work, she would, and in the barracks, she would sing these songs to her fellow Frenchwomen. And of course, it was never performed. It couldn't be performed.
In the camp?
In a camp, no. But it did, and it was actually printed. People wrote it out and circulated among other Frenchwomen. It was, believe it or not, it's very funny. And I will just say, because I don't know if we'll get a chance to do it, it was finally performed like 50 years after the liberation of the camp. Germaine Tillion was still alive in one of the biggest theaters in Paris. But I mean, that was the only way they could have survived, was because of these incredible ties, these incredible connections that these women made with each other, and then also in the fact that they did rebel. They did stand up against the Germans.
So now the war is over. The camp is liberated. What happens to these women, and what happens when they come back to France?
Well, they thought they were going to. I mean, the survivors, and the four women that I write most about, all survived. They thought and the others thought they were going to come back to a country that would welcome them, that would appreciate what they had done for France, and they were so broken, they were so bruised, they had been through so much trauma, and many of them were physically close to death. But they had been through hell, literally hell. And then they come back to a country that wants nothing to do with them, basically. France, by that time, had decided they wanted to the people who had lived there, it was time to move on. And part of it was, quite frankly, the inability to cope with the fact that the country capitulated, B, that the legal government collaborated with the Germans, and C, that a number of other people in France collaborated. I mean, the French really couldn't come to grips with that then. So these women came back and basically were treated, you know, like pariahs. I mean, but you know, friends, family. I'm not all of them. But they were not warmly welcomed, to put it mildly. Many of them were not warmly welcomed. So it was an incredibly difficult period. And they weren't the only ones. I mean, that was true for resistance men as well. But what these women did, what the women of Ravensbruk did, was to form an organization of women who had been in prisons and in concentration camps to help them. Again, they banded together to help them recover physically and mentally. I mean, this was not just like this, small little organization. They had a big building in Paris. They had a hospital there. They had 17 doctors on staff. I mean, for the most seriously physically wounded people. They had mental health facilities. They found jobs for women. I mean, it was a huge operation, and it continued, until like 15 or 20 years ago. These women stuck together. They took care of each other, and they helped each other put together their lives. But that's not the only thing they did. They basically formed that organization also to let the people of France know that they were not going to be treated, like people in the shadows. I mean, that's what basically de Gaulle and the Free French tried to do when the war was over, is to basically say that men were the major actors in the resistance, that women didn't do very much. It was all part of the kind of, I mentioned the fact that the French society was very conservative, very male-oriented, very traditional, and so de Gaulle and his people were as sexist as the rest of France. And even though his own niece had been one of the major resistance leaders, he said it was basically all men who had been involved. And so what these women were doing was basically saying, that's not true. I mean, we did as much as the men. Before we were captured, we resisted as much or more than the men. We suffered as much as the men, and we expect you to regard us as just as you regard the men. I mean, that's one of the points that I make in all three of my books about France and women in the resistance, is the fact that if it hadn't been for women, the resistance would never have gotten off the ground. Women were really the lifeblood of the resistance. As I said, they helped form the first resistance organization, but they were active all the way through. They formed escape lines. The many escape lines that helped Allied servicemen get back to front lines. They were run by women. They were spies. They were even saboteurs, and yet, after the war, because men wrote most of the books immediately after the war for the first 3 or 4 decades, mostly male historians, women were an afterthought, and men, were at the center of the stage. So that organization, as I said, actually kept going until just a few years ago, when the last of these women died. Actually, I discovered, Dory, that one of the women in the group is still alive. She's 103 years old. Wow. But it really was quite remarkable what they did.
So I'm going to ask the audience a question. When did women get the right to vote in America? 1920, right? Now, next question. When did women get the right to vote in France? Guess, just guess.
1950s. After the war.
When?
After the war.
Ah, she's French.
Actually, it was during the war, but it was in 1944. Can you believe it? 1944. Women did not have the right to vote in France till 1944. And you know why they got the right to vote? Because of the women in the resistance. Because actually, it's the men in the provisional legislature in Algeria. They passed in the Constitution, in the new Constitution. It was because the women in the resistance had been so important and had done so much that they were given the right to vote.
So we may go over time. I do want to leave time for questions, but if you have to leave, you have to leave anyway. But there are two more subjects. One, the rabbits.
The rabbits. The rabbits were Polish prisoners, young women, Polish women, who were chosen as guinea pigs in horrific medical experiments at Ravensbruk. And the experiments were on their legs. They were testing, these horrific doctors were testing sulfa drugs, and I won't go into it because it takes too long to explain why they were doing it, but they cut open these women's legs, these young women's legs, and inserted bacteria, gangrene, all sorts of stuff, dirt to cause infections. But it wasn't just little, they cut their legs open to the bone. And then, and probably 60, 70 young Polish resistance members had to go through these horrific operations, some more than once. And a number of them died right away. But the ones who survived, basically almost all of them were crippled. It was just awful. And I write a lot about them during the war. They became very close to the Frenchwomen. The Poles became very close to the Frenchwomen. Toward the end of the war, it became very clear that the Germans were planning to kill them, the young Poles. They were called the rabbits instead of guinea pigs, but it was the same thing, that they were going to kill them to erase any witnesses to these horrific experiments. And the camp knew it. Everybody in the camp knew what was going on. They knew about the Poles, the young Poles. They were trying to protect them. And in fact, in early 1945, it became clear that this was about to happen. And I go into great detail about this. The whole camp came together to prevent this. And on the morning when the SS officers were coming to take the Poles and take them away and kill them, the camp rose up. And basically, the whole camp rose up. And in fact, they saved them. The camp was so overcrowded at that point that the Germans were close to losing control, and they did lose control. They hid all these young women, and they refused to do what the guards tried to make them do. So all of these young Poles survived until the end of the war. I mean, it's not much attention has been paid to it because there were in other concentration camps there were uprisings, but I think this one was really the most successful uprising in terms of actually saving people's lives.
Now, there's another woman who there's not that much about in the book until the end. Her name was Germaine Durenti.
Mm-hmm.
And she had an influence as it related to the rabbits, I think, and also as it related to somebody that everybody in the room knows.
Yes, I'll be very quick about it. Germaine Durenti was another countess who was in Marie Madeleine Foucault's intelligence organization. She and her husband were involved, and she was a socialite in Paris, and they were arrested, and her husband was sent to Buchenwald, and she was sent to Ravensbruk, and went through hell, absolute hell. But this fragile-looking countess turned out to be one of the toughest women in Ravensbruk, and survived, and came back, and then got involved with this organization that I told you that was founded. And my favorite part of the book is about Germaine Durenti because she was very much a fixture in Paris society. And when she came back, she was at a dinner party with her daughter. The pre-dinner conversation, a young woman said, "Well, you look fantastic. It can't, it's obvious that all the stories we've heard are absolutely wrong about concentration camps. Look at you." And Germaine turned to her and said, basically, every morning, every evening, we carried the women who had just died into the washrooms and left their bodies there. And in the morning when we went there, we had to step over them, and their eyes were already gone were eaten by rats. And then she got up and she ordered her daughter to come with her, and she walked out, and that was the end of her in society. She became a totally different woman. Basically, I am going to do what I want to do, and to hell with you, basically. And she became one of the main leaders in this organization. But she had no money. I mean, these women weren't given any money by the government after they got out, so she had to somehow find a way to support herself, and so she did that by taking in college students who were at the Sorbonne or various other places, and she particularly took in American students who were on their junior year abroad. And in 1949, she took in a young woman named Jacqueline Bouvier, who was on her junior year from Vassar. She was, Germaine basically became her second mother, and became very, very close to this young woman, and basically taught her. She had been through such hell, Germaine, that she was really focused on beauty. So she took Jacqueline around to, to museums and to neighborhoods, and showed her the beauty of Paris, basically. She took her under her wing, and basically, and stayed incredibly close to her for the rest of her life. And one of the main reasons Jacqueline Kennedy was involved in the White House and in historic preservation was because of Germaine de Renty. Germaine de Renty was her mentor. She and Jacqueline Kennedy talked about her serving an apprenticeship under Germaine de Renty. So I loved the story. That after the house she had been in, she managed to instill in this young American woman the whole concept of beauty, and
Well, I have a lot of pages turned down in the book, and I had planned to give everybody one piece of paper with some of the quotes, but I didn't have time. But I'm going to read one. This is on page 294. Sometimes I say we're a little bit like watchmen in the night. We feel the need to warn that this attitude to despise human beings we consider inferior is how we ended up with places like Auschwitz and Ravensbruk. And then, of course, there are terrible people in the world, but there is also much greatness, so much nobility that exists. That's the message we want to get across. Yes, we have worries, but we have hope. Now, questions. Who wants to hand me the questions? I see we have 2 college students over here.
We're handing them to you, or just
Does anybody have questions?
or you could just say it.
Yes.
Yes, when you talked about Geneviève de Gaulle, and I know that the General de Gaulle was close to his niece, when she went there, the fact that she was a de Gaulle, the German didn't put a special pressure on her that would, to put pressure on her uncle to change what he's doing.
That's a great question. And I don't know if everybody heard that. Why weren't the didn't the Germans know? When she arrived there, de Gaulle had not yet. He was still. This was before D-Day, so de Gaulle was not a real threat. I mean, he was not in France at that point.
Then she stayed there. So when they learned about him, and then she was there under their
Eventually, they put her into a different place. Toward the end of the war, Himmler, who was in charge of the concentration camps, was trying to get de Gaulle to kind of help him with a separate piece. So he was using Genevieve as a hostage, but that was much later. Initially, I think because he had not yet, I mean, he was not as nearly as important as he became, that the Germans really weren't thinking about him. But it made a big difference to the French women in the camp to have a de Gaulle there. I mean, she laughed later in life, and she said, you know, I was a mini de Gaulle. You know, I was a symbol. She was a symbol to them. And she went around to each barracks and talked about him, about her uncle, and you know, and his leadership, etc. So she was very, very important in that regard. But it wasn't until toward the end of the war. She was actually taken out of the prison population and put into a separate place because Himmler wanted to use her as a hostage. She did get out early. She was released early because de Gaulle finally, he refused initially to even consider, you know, dealing with the Germans over her, but he got very worried about her toward the end, and so she did get out early.
So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Who betrayed these women and why, do we know?
There were a lot of different, I mean, the problem with resistance organizations was the bigger they got, the more dangerous they got, because, you know, a lot of people, you know, the Germans had a lot of agents. I mean, used Frenchmen and women as agents, and they would infiltrate these organizations. The person that betrayed Germaine and Anise was a French priest who had a parish, and not far from where Germaine and her mother lived. And he sold himself to the Germans and you know, managed to get away with it for, I don't know, probably more than a year. He had 2 mistresses. I mean, the guy was, the only time he went to church was on Sunday when he celebrated Mass and gave speeches saying how much of a resistant he was. And he encouraged young people to join the resistance groups, and everybody fell for him, and basically he was turning them over to the Germans.
Yes.
Were these women eventually considered as just after the war?
Pardon?
You know the concept of the just among the just, that French people like named some resistant figures after the war. Were they considered as just afterwards? Or maybe like, because we, like the name of these women are familiar, some of them have like even historical figures, but like.
Yes, they were. I mean, I'll give you. Well, you all know about the Pantheon. You know, where the great mostly men of France are buried. In 2015, they added 4 new people to the Pantheon. Up to that time, there was only 1 woman. There were 71 people, authors, statesmen, generals, who were honored. That's all. 71. Only 1 woman. Who was that? No, not at that point. Okay, we're talking about 2015. Marie Curie. Marie Curie was the only woman. And in 2015, as I said, they added 4. 2 of them were women. So it made, you know, so there now were 3. Those 2 women were Germaine Tillion and Genevieve de Gaulle. So they basically, it was the then president of France. It was to honor all women in the French resistance, most of whom were unknown, and it was to basically say, it was finally women got the credit they deserved, and subsequently there have been others. Josephine Baker is now
really in the Pantheon.
She is, yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The concentration camps, I read that the reason they tried to kill everyone before those camps being erected is that they didn't want to show how those people were. You know, in
Right, right.
Civilized people.
Absolutely. No,
Destroy,
that's
destroy the evidence.
Yeah, they were trying. They were trying very hard.
You would never know, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll just make one last. You know what really, I did not know this, struck me was how few of these horrific Germans were actually brought to justice. I mean, I was just under the impression, because we all know about the Nuremberg trials, and the leaders were caught, and most of them were executed. And then there were later Nuremberg trials for judges and doctors and et cetera, et cetera. But that was about it. I mean, there were tens of thousands, certainly thousands of guards, et cetera, at Ravensbruk throughout the 4 or 5 years, both women and men. And of that number, probably 45 were put on, were tried. And most of them did not die. There were a number who were executed. But it's really quite stunning that basically, and that's because the United States led the charge for Western countries that that same attitude that, okay, the war's over, we have a new enemy, that's Soviet Union. We're in the Cold War now, and who is a big ally now? The West Germans. And so it was basically let bygones be bygones, and now we're focusing on the Soviet Union.
Did any of these women play a role in that, at Nuremberg as a trial, as, witnesses to bring testimony?
There were none of the 4 that I'm talking about, but there were a number of French women who did testify at Nuremberg. One whose name escapes me right now, but she was a communist, and she was another leader of the French women, and she was one of the first witnesses. She had been in Auschwitz before, and was sent to Ravensbruk, and she talked about seeing Jews being killed, and it was one of the first direct testimonies about the extermination of the Jews.
Sebu?
Yes, you talked about these women as unsung heroes, and that you have this track record at this point of writing about unsung heroes. What's your process? How do you find out these stories? How do you learn about these women? What's your process of uncovering
Right.
these stories?
Well, it's basically, as I said, things I've learned from doing research in previous books. Germaine Tillion appeared, for example, in the book I wrote about Empress of the Nile, about Christiane de Roche-Noblescourt. She was one of the founders of the network that Christiane was in. So, I mean, her name kept popping up. But, to be quite honest, what really got me interested in it was not these main figures. It was Germaine de Renty, because I read about her. I was reading something about Jackie Kennedy, and I read, oh my God, there's this woman that was in Marie Madeleine-Foucault's group, and I had never heard of her before, and then started looking into it, and then I found, oh my, this is just an amazing story. And so I initially thought, well, I'll write something about her, but that wouldn't carry a book. It had to be more than that. So, and then I started, really investigating it, and then, came up with, she plays a big role in this book, but she's not one of the 4 main characters.
But that's the process I'm asking about, I guess. So I'm curious about lots of things. What, do you start traveling? Do you go to?
I read.
Yeah, you just read.
I mean, initially, that's what I do. I try to read as much as I can, and I mean, a lot of it, as I said, when I was talking about Marie Madeleine-Foucault, I kept finding these little references to her, and I thought initially, my first thing is to find out if a book has been written about whatever I'm interested in, and if it hasn't been, then I get deeper into it and try to find enough information, and then the dirty little secret is that you can't just have it, it's a great idea, but selling your publisher on it, and so you have to frame it in a way that and framing is just absolutely essential. You have to do it in such a way that to say, oh yeah, that would make a good book.
So we have for sale, we have the Sisterhood, and I also brought in 5 copies of Madame Foucault's War in case you haven't read that, because well, they all have so much information in them. Putting the links together, when
Christiane.
When Christiane was trying to save the Abu Simbel, it was right after the Suez War. And so the French were definitely not interested in helping, and the Americans weren't much interested in helping. But there was one American who really made a difference, Jacqueline Kennedy. So that kind of puts that...
She pops up again. Yeah, she was... If it hadn't been for Jacqueline Kennedy, Abu Simbel wouldn't have been saved, because she went to her husband and said, he had just been elected, and said, you've got to do this. You've got to save these temples, and he went along with it. And,
I mean, I can think of Anne Frank's journals. I mean, how come this woman never wrote, or that was because of the time, or?
How come they what?
I can think of Frank, the journal of Anne Frank.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
And how come there are no more, not after women writing about their experience?
They did, actually. These women, 3 of the women wrote memoirs, but they're all in French. So, this is all new to an American audience. Yeah.
I'm going to the airport.
Oh, you're going to the
I
airport.
guess that's
Oh
it.
my
Thank
God.
you so much.
We'll send you a
Really
book.
appreciate it.
Oh, is he here?
Thanks for coming out on this rainy night.
Of course.
I read Empress of the Nile right when we were going to
Uh-huh.
Isn't that amazing? It's hard to believe. It's true.
I know.
You did such a marvelous job in that book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Everyone I know, if they're
Hi,
ever
Sarah.
going, they have to read your books. They do.
I think I've heard that from a number of people. Yeah, it's always.